In this video I'm going to be talking about both the historical context of An Inspector Calls and how it deals with the concept of social class, and I've decided to combine those into a single video because I think they are very much bound together. Now I want to start out by talking about the two different time frames that are relevant to this play. On the one hand you have 1912, which is the time the play is set, and on the other hand you have 1945, which is the time Priestley wrote the play. So it's important always to bear in mind that Priestley, when he constructs this 1912 setting, is doing so with the benefit of historical hindsight. So the play is set at the end of the Edwardian era, which is the period of time that separates the Victorian era from the First World War. In terms of society and culture and fashion, it wasn't hugely different from the Victorian period. We were still talking about a time where roles of gender and roles of class were very, very, very firmly set. What started to happen during this period in a big way was the spread of what we would understand to be modern technology, particularly early electronics. The telephone starts to become widespread here. So does early recorded music. It's the era of the beginning of cinema, that kind of thing. The dark side of that is the industrialization and the mechanization of the military. And it's that that led to the scale and horror of the First World War, which started in 1914 and really brought the Edwardian era to an end. I might go so far as to say that the First World War is the true cultural beginning of the 20th century. So that's the context of the setting of the play. This is the world inhabited by the characters. Priestley's world, 1945, is extremely different. It's changed unrecognisably, considering that it's actually a relatively short interval of time between them. 1945, Britain had just emerged victorious from the Second World War. Europe had been very badly damaged. Britain was in a great deal of debt. But alongside that, there was a feeling of optimism. Fascism had been defeated, and there was a sense of opportunity. The old ways that had led to war were over, and there was now the chance to rebuild society in a way that was more egalitarian and would lead to a more prosperous future. That was the theory, and it led to an absolutely colossal victory for the Labour government in 1945, and that's where the NHS makes its debut, and it's where we see the beginning of the modern welfare state. So what Priestley's doing in setting the play when he's setting it is he's looking back at a time where the old social order, as he sees it, was about to come to an end. Now, on the subject of social order, I want to talk about the British class system of 1912, or at least the class system as Mr. Birling appears to understand it. This is a simplification of the reality, but that simplification better reflects what class means to Mr. Birling. He does not have a particularly sophisticated understanding of the class system, and recognising that these terms lack a bit of subtlety helps us to understand and analyse him as a character, because he lacks subtlety. So we'll start out with the upper class. The upper classes are associated with inheriting rather than earning wealth. So we're not talking about businessmen and industrialists here. We're talking about the aristocracy, people who own land and whose families have owned land going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Because it's associated with what you inherit rather than what you've earned, there isn't very much an individual person can do to become upper class. Virtually the definition of upper class is that you haven't earned your wealth, you've inherited it. So that puts Birling, however rich he is, in the middle class. He is a business owner. He owns capital, be it money or be it factory equipment, that allows him to make use of the labour of the working class. That makes him a member of the bourgeoisie. And part of Birling's neurosis is that he has this desire to become a member of the upper class, but he knows that he never really can, because however much money he earns, he just doesn't have the right kind of background, the right kind of breeding. Now, below Birling is the working class, and that's where Eva Smith fits. Here, earnings are not based on what you own. Eva Smith doesn't really own anything apart from the clothes she's wearing. So the working class sell their labour to the middle classes in exchange for basic necessities. So this three-tier system is class as Birling understands it. And like I said earlier, he is middle class, he's very rich, and he's driven by the desire to become part of the upper class that he can't ever really be a part of. And that awkward, neurotic, paranoid relationship with class characterises so much of his interactions with other characters. I've picked out a few key quotations here, all from relatively early in the play. The very first line of the play is Birling talking to Gerald, his future son-in-law, and pointing out a specific brand of port that he's bought. He also points out that it's exactly the same port that Gerald's wealthy father buys. Now, this seems at first glance to be a fairly trivial interaction, just setting some background scenery. But think about what it says about Birling. Birling has no reason to point out the specific brand of port other than to try to associate himself with other wealthy people. And this gets at the heart of what Birling thinks class means. Birling thinks class is marked by stuff, by objects, by material possessions. So this seemingly inconsequential moment where he points out a particular brand of port is actually very important for giving us an insight into how Birling feels he needs to showcase the fact that he can buy certain possessions. A little bit later, in the second quotation, Birling expresses his worries that Gerald's mother may not approve of the Birling family because they don't have the right aristocratic connections. He tries to compensate for that by suggesting that he's in line for a knighthood. And look at the false modesty, just a knighthood, of course, as if it's something that doesn't really matter to Birling, when in fact it's everything that he cares about. He is absolutely obsessed with this idea of appearing upper class, and the thought that somebody else might judge him for not being upper class explains a lot of his neurosis over the course of the play. Mrs. Birling, on the other hand, comes from a slightly different position. We're told right at the beginning in the opening stage directions that she is her husband's social superior. So she represents the kind of good breeding that Mr. Birling holds in such esteem. She holds very aristocratic attitudes towards society and culture that are extremely inbuilt and internalized within her. We see this right from the beginning when she's correcting her family's behavior around the dinner table. But the clearest example of it comes later during her interrogation by the inspector, when she's defending herself against the accusation of heartlessness in her dealing with Eva Smith. Her attitudes towards class are so deeply ingrained in her character that she cannot look beyond stereotypical views of class when talking about Eva specifically. Her entire attitude towards Eva is based on stereotypes. So look at this quotation here. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. It sounded ridiculous to me. Now look at the situation this puts Eva Smith in. It's an absolute lose-lose position. If Eva Smith had been rude, Mrs. Birling could have dismissed it as being typical of her class. Because she's polite, Mrs. Birling instead suggests that Eva is being dishonest to her. Now, admittedly, Eva did not help her own case by giving a false name to Mrs. Birling. But nevertheless, the point stands. There is no approach that Eva could have taken that Mrs. Birling could not have found a pretext for dismissing. That is virtually the definition of prejudice. Because she has such a stereotypical view of what it means to be working class, Mrs. Birling has made up her mind about Eva Smith before she's had any opportunity to make an argument. So from Eva's point of view, why not make up a false name? It seems that her desperation is entirely justified by the circumstances. Now, before I wrap up, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the inspector. The inspector's role in the play is to highlight and expose the prejudice and hypocrisy that we see from the Birling family. Now, some of this comes directly from the accusations the inspector makes of the family, but some of it comes merely from his nature, his manner, his behaviour. He has an innate sense of authority that Birling just can't match. The inspector is authoritative without being authoritarian, whereas with Mr. Birling it's the other way round. Mr. Birling is constantly trying to remind other characters of his authority, which is a sure sign that he doesn't really have it. The inspector doesn't need to remind anyone of his authority, he just has it. The subtext of this is that integrity, morality, and worth has nothing to do with class. But it's very important to the themes of the play that the elder Birlings, Mr. Birling and his wife, don't really take that message in. It falls to the younger Birlings, Eric and Sheila, to appreciate it. So to sum up, Mr. and Mrs. Birling stand in for a social order that Priestley regards as being outdated. It's about to be swept aside by a pair of world wars, and Priestley uses the fact that he has this historical knowledge to showcase how complacent Birling is. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here, because it would be easy to fall into the trap of criticising Birling for not knowing things that it's not reasonable to expect him to know. Nobody in 1912 thought the Titanic would sink before it sank. Nobody in 1912 could reasonably have expected the First World War to have gone the way it did. So we shouldn't be thinking of it in terms of Birling being stupid, but we should be thinking about it in terms of Birling being complacent. He is too comfortable. He cannot see the risks to his own position, and that's Priestley's point. So it's no coincidence that the moral lesson of the play comes from an explicitly working class character in the inspector. That is consistent with Priestley's own socialist principles. And I'm just going to leave with one more point. The fact that the elder Birlings don't learn the lesson, but the younger Birlings do, is Priestley's argument in a nutshell. His point is that the kind of social change that he regarded as a positive requires the younger generation to take over from the old, and in that you see a kind of symbol for the optimism that Priestley had for the future of the country and the world.